The Yangtze River runs through southern China, one of the most populated areas on Earth. The people who lived here at this time in history were primarily poor and depended on the river for water for their personal and farming needs. Problem is, they live right along the river's banks. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. Now, we pick up in progress the Yangtze River flooding of August 18, 1931, this day in weather history. The 1931 China floods, also known as the 1931 Yangtze River floods, were a series of floods that occurred from June to August of that year in the Republic of China, hitting major cities like Wuhan, Nanjing, and beyond. They eventually culminated into a dike breach along Lake Gaoyou on August 26th. In April of 1931, the river basin area had already received a far above average rainfall, so then, when the truly torrential rains came again in July, the stage was set for certain disaster. The Yangtze flooded over a 500 square mile area. By the beginning of August, the rapidly rising waters drove 500,000 people from their homes. Then, on August 18th, 1931, this day in weather history, the Yangtze River in China peaked during a horrible and now historic flood. This was perhaps the worst natural disaster of the 20th century. The cost to human life was astronomical. Remember now, they live by the water, so if it rises up against them, they lose. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider. But there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective. And oftentimes, they will include visuals from that day's event, from when it happened, in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. Fatality estimates, as you can appreciate, for the place and time vary widely. One estimate from a field survey immediately after the flood said that 150,000 people had drowned, and that this number represented less than a quarter of all the fatalities during the first 100 days of this flood. The 100-day flood? That's right. It was estimated that this event actually killed 3.7 million people directly or indirectly over the duration of the next several months. That included a claim that, and I quote, 2 million people died during the flood, having drowned or died from lack of food. And because of the squalid living conditions that followed this wiping out of all the homes in the region, there was a follow-up cholera epidemic that was declared. So just how did this flood happen to such a catastrophic level? If you pour a bucket of water over pavement, what happens? Most of it runs off, while just a trace of it absorbs. This is a similar setup for dry land that is so hardened by drought that it is almost like concrete. And from 1928 to 1930, China suffered a long and brutal drought. Now pair that with the harsh winter of 1930, where the heavy snow and ice accumulated in the nearby mountainous areas, and you can see how this is already shaping up. Early in 1931, the melting snow and ice flowed downstream and poured into the middle of the Yangtze, coinciding with a period of heavy spring rain. Now, flooding, as I said off the top, is normal for this region because of its climate norms and topography. But this year, there was just this single continuous deluge. The Yangtze region was literally drowned. To summarize, in July of 1931, 9 cyclones hit the region, way more than the average of 2 per year. 4 weather stations along the Yangtze River reported rainfall totals of over 600 millimeters. That's 24 inches. That's also known as 2 feet for the month. The Yangtze reached its highest water level since record-keeping began back in the mid-19th century. Remember the part about how this region, for its time and place, was already a destitute population before this happened? So as a result of this, many areas descended into famine. With no food, people were reduced to eating tree bark, weeds, and earth. And that's the sugar-coated version of the realities that followed. The rest, I am not able to mention in this podcast because of its horrifically graphic nature. all from a massive domino effect of terrible events that would crescendo with a massive flood that truly delivered the knockout punch on August 18th, 1931, this day in weather history. Tomorrow is August 19th, and that is the day in weather history when it was suspected that within a passage of a series of thunderstorms, there spawned tornadoes, damaging homes in Conestoga Lake, Fergus, and Tavistock areas, and possibly the biggest city in the country of Canada, Toronto. We'll find out tomorrow on This Day in Weather History with me, your host, Chris May.